In the autumn of 1887, on the Dakota frontier, Deborah ignored every rule of survival. While others stacked wood and sealed every draft with mud and straw, she boiled flour paste and pasted 6 thick layers of newsprint onto the cabin walls. Folk called it madness. Some said she'd frost herself to death. But when the cold snap hit 41 below zero, those yellowed pages yielded a forgotten inheritance and a truth she had fled from her entire life. Her name was Deborah, and she was nobody's fool. She had crossed half the continent alone, leaving a comfortable life back east under circumstances the frontier didn't need to ask about. Her cabin stood on a windswept claim no other settler would work. No family, no hired hand, just a brown dog and a quiet determination that made her neighbors uncomfortable. By November of that year, they had all written her off. But Deborah wasn't just insulating a shack. She was burying a story beneath those flower paste pages, a story that someone, somewhere, was still hunting. The question was never whether the paper would keep out the cold. The question was what it really concealed. She had arrived in the Dakota Badlands during the first thaw of 1887, a season when even the prairie grass looked uncertain. The window of the land office had still carried a faint frost when she signed for the claim, 160 acres of hardpan and shortgrass near a scratch of water called Cane Creek. The agent, a man with a walrus mustache and tired eyes, glanced up at her once, then twice. Women alone did not file for claims in that district. Widows sometimes did, but they usually had a grown son or a brother-in-law somewhere nearby. This woman had neither. She paid the filing fee in worn banknotes, folded small enough to fit inside a locket, and she wrote her name as Deborah K. Ingram in neat, practiced letters. She did not offer a married name. She did not explain the case. She simply took the papers, loaded her trunk onto a borrowed handcart, and walked 3 miles into the prairie with a brown dog trotting at her heel like a shadow stitched to her ankles. By late summer, the talk had already started. The nearest homesteads were scattered along the creek bottoms and ridgelines, 5 or 6 families mostly, plus a bachelor trapper named Lindquist who spoke more to his mule than to people. News traveled on foot, or by wagon, or by leaning across a split-rail fence on Sunday afternoons. The question that got asked most often was the simplest one. What was a woman like that doing out here alone? She was not uncomely. She had the look of someone who had once owned better clothes and known finer rooms. Her dress was faded but well stitched, and her hands, though callous now, did not carry the deep-grooved roughness of someone born to manual labor. She spoke little, and when she did, her accent did not match the territory. Some said they heard a trace of Philadelphia in it. Others swore it was Baltimore. Nobody could agree, and Deborah offered nothing to settle the matter. She worked her garden. She mended the cabin's sagging roof. She shot a rattlesnake off the porch with a single-action revolver that she handled like a cavalry veteran, and she never once invited company inside. That was the thing that bothered the other women most. Not the gun, not the solitary walks at dusk, but the closed door. In a land where survival meant neighbor helping neighbor, a door that never opened felt like a quiet accusation. By October, a few of the men had begun to mutter that she was probably one of those spiritualists who had fled some scandal back east. Mrs. Hedstrom, whose husband ran the tiny trading post at the crossroads, was convinced Deborah had been a wealthy man's mistress, sent away to vanish. None of it was true, but all of it was easier to swallow than the real explanation, which nobody had yet guessed. Then came the paper. It started innocently enough. Late in October, Deborah walked into the trading post and asked Mr. Hedstrom if he had any old newspapers. Not fresh editions, she said. Old ones, the older the better. Hedstrom had a stack of back issues that had been used as packing material for shipments of lamp oil and canned milk. Most were from Omaha, some were from as far away as New York and Chicago. They were yellowed, brittle, and at least 2 years out of date. She bought them for a few pennies and carried them home in a burlap sack. The next week she returned and bought the rest. Then she began asking if anyone had newsprint that could be spared. Lindquist donated a stack he had used to line his trap shed. Mrs. Hedstrom's sister sent over a bundle of old copies of the Yankton Press and Dakotan that she had been saving for kindling. Nobody understood why Deborah wanted them, but nobody refused her. Not yet. By the time they understood what she was doing with those papers, it was too late to stop her. She boiled the flour paste on the wood stove, stirring until the mixture thickened into a gray-white glue that smelled faintly of bread dough. Then she tore the newspapers into wide, irregular sheets, dipped each one, and pressed it flat against the inside walls of her one-room cabin. She worked from early morning until the light failed, her dog curled near the stove, while the paste dried in translucent streaks across the raw pine boards. She did not stop at one layer. She did not stop at two. She built layer after layer, smoothing each sheet with the flat of her hand, until the entire interior was covered with a dense, overlapping skin of newsprint 6 pages thick. When she finished, the walls of that cabin looked like a library that had collapsed inward. Headlines ran sideways, upside down, stacked so tightly that their letters bled together. The ink had softened in places from the moisture, but the words could still be read if anyone cared to look closely. Deborah cared very much. The first neighbor to actually see the finished interior was young Ben Hedstrom, the trader's 12-year-old son, who had been sent to deliver a sack of flour and a tin of molasses. He stood in the doorway for nearly a full minute without speaking. Then he ran all the way home and told his mother that the Ingram woman had wallpapered her entire house with old news, and that it smelled strange inside, like a bakery and a cellar at the same time. Within 2 days, every family within 10 miles had heard about the paper walls, and the laughter began. They called it the newsprint cabin. Some called it Deborah's folly. A few of the rougher men started referring to it as the paper coffin, because everyone knew paper and paste would never hold heat when the real cold came. The Hedstrom's hired hand, a broad-shouldered Norwegian named Olafsson, laughed so hard he had to sit down on a barrel. He had built his own cabin with proper sod brick 2 seasons earlier and swore by it. Paper was for reading, he said, not for building. His wife agreed. Fancy city notions, she sniffed. Paper won't stop a frost. She'll be frozen solid by Christmas. The laughter was not entirely cruel. It was the laughter of people who had learned, through hard winters and harder luck, that the prairie did not forgive cleverness. It only rewarded what was solid, tested, and likely to remain standing after the wind stopped screaming. And nothing about a 6-layer newspaper wall struck anyone as solid. But if those neighbors had looked closer at the pages Deborah pasted across her walls, if they had read the dates, the cities, the specific articles she chose from dozens of available sheets, they might have begun to ask very different questions. She did not paste the pages randomly. She selected certain columns, certain notices, certain announcements printed in small type near the back of the Eastern editions. One evening in early November, as the first skate of ice began forming along Cane Creek, Deborah stood inside her finished cabin and ran her fingertip across a short paragraph buried beneath layers of paste. It was a legal notice, dated June 1885, printed in the Philadelphia Inquirer. The notice described an unclaimed inheritance. A substantial sum, $10,000, held in trust by a law firm for a missing female heir. The notice listed a name that was not Deborah Ingram, but it was a name Deborah knew better than her own heartbeat. And unless someone with sharp eyes and a long memory happened to stand inside this cabin and read that particular square of newsprint, that name would stay buried inside 6 layers of paste and prairie winter forever. That was exactly what she intended. Because the inheritance was not the secret. The inheritance was the trap. And back in Philadelphia, there were men who had been searching for the woman who owned that name for 2 years, men who would pay a great deal more than $10,000 to find her. Deborah had not come to the Dakota Badlands to build a new life. She had come to make an old life impossible to trace. The paper walls were not insulation against the cold. They were insulation against her former existence. Every layer was another mile between her and the people who still believed she owed them a debt that could only be settled in blood. And then, just as the last of the autumn light faded from the prairie, the winter that would test everything began to send its first warnings into the basin. The temperature dropped so sharply one night that water buckets cracked. Old-timers like Lindquist, who read weather in the joints of his own hands, told anyone who would listen that something mean was gathering beyond the northern ridgeline. The last time the sky had looked this way, in the winter of 1883, 40 head of cattle had frozen standing upright in a drift that took until April to thaw. The farmers double-checked their snow fences. The homesteaders hauled extra firewood, and every single one of them looked toward Deborah's cabin and shook their heads. The first real test of the newsprint walls would not arrive for another few weeks. But already, on that cold November morning, one man had started looking at the paper house with an expression that was not amusement. It was curiosity. His name was Samuel Rundle, and he had spent 12 years as a deputy marshal in Chicago before a bullet in his hip retired him to the dry air of Dakota. He knew how to read people the way Lindquist read weather. And when he stopped by the trading post and overheard Olafson describing how the Ingram woman had covered her walls in Eastern newspapers, including, Olafson happened to mention, a lot of pages from Philadelphia, something old and alert moved behind his eyes. That afternoon, Rundle rode out to the Ingram claim with a tin of coffee as a neighborly excuse. He was not expected. He was not wanted. He stepped onto the porch, knocked, and waited while the brown dog growled low from inside. Deborah opened the door just enough to be polite, and in that narrow gap, Samuel Rundle saw the wall behind her. 6 layers deep, headlines overlapping, a date June 1885, and a fragment of a name that he was certain he had seen before on a wanted circular or an inheritance notice, he could not yet remember which. He smiled, thanked her for the coffee he had not yet received, and asked whether he might step inside. The silence that followed held more danger than any Dakota storm. Deborah did not step aside. She stood in the gap of the doorway, one hand resting against the frame, her body a deliberate barrier. The brown dog pressed against her skirt, a low growl still rumbling in its throat. Samuel Rundle had spent too many years reading small refusals to mistake this one for shyness. This was a locked door wearing a woman's shape. He nodded slowly, tipping the brim of his hat with an ease that did not match the sharpness in his eyes. "Maybe another time," he said. His voice was mild. His attention was not. As he turned back toward his horse, his gaze swept once more across the wall behind her, a fragment of a headline, the date June 1885, and the first 3 letters of a surname that prickled at his memory like a burr caught in wool. He did not look back as he rode away, but Deborah watched him until the dust settled. Inside, she closed the door and stood motionless in the dim, paper-lined room. The dog whined once, then settled. Slowly, she crossed to the wall beside the stove and lifted the lantern so the light fell across a particular sheet of newsprint, the legal notices from Philadelphia. Her fingertip traced the line. Any person having knowledge of the whereabouts of Miss Eleanor Van Doren, last seen in the city of Philadelphia in March of 1885, is urged to communicate with the undersigned attorneys, as a matter of considerable inheritance remains unclaimed. The name Eleanor Van Doren had not been spoken aloud in more than 2 years. It belonged to a woman who had been the only daughter of a wealthy railroad investor, a woman who had been engaged to a man whose family owned half the coal contracts in Pennsylvania. A woman who had fled 3 weeks before her wedding, not with a lover, but with a leather satchel containing $9,000 in banknotes, 2 sets of false identification documents, and a secret that would have sent her fiancé's entire family to prison. The inheritance was real, but it was not a gift. It was bait. The law firm that placed that notice was retained by the Cole family, the Haslets. They had been searching for Eleanor not because they wanted to pay her, but because she could testify. She had the ledgers, the receipts, the proof that the Haslets had been bribing federal inspectors to overlook safety violations in their mines. 3 men had died in a shaft collapse that should never have happened, and Eleanor Van Doren had learned the truth on an afternoon that began with tea in her fiancé's parlor and ended with her picking a lock on his father's office desk. The $9,000 was not stolen from the Haslets. It was her own inheritance from her mother's estate, withdrawn in secret before they could freeze her accounts. She had planned her disappearance for 6 weeks. The false papers, the frontier claim, the isolated cabin, Every piece had been chosen to place her beyond the reach of men who had reason to make sure she never testified anywhere. And if those men ever found her, the inheritance notice would not lead them to a courtroom. It would lead them to a shallow grave on the open prairie. Deborah pressed her palm flat over the newsprint, as though she could press the name deeper into the flour paste and out of existence. Then she stepped back. The walls held their silence. Outside, the wind had begun to rise, not yet a storm, but the first unsteady breath of a winter that was gathering itself in the north. Lindquist later told the Headstroms that he could smell snow 3 days before it came, and that year the smell started in the first week of November. The old trapper stood in the door of his sod shack every morning, sniffing the air like a bear testing the season. "Cold's coming harder than '83, he said to no one in particular. The others listened. Lindquist had predicted the October freeze of 1885 within a day, and he had once amputated a man's frostbitten toe with a wood chisel and saved the foot. His word carried weight. By the middle of November, the temperature dropped low enough that children were forbidden from walking to the creek alone. The prairie grass crunched underfoot like broken glass. Olafson, still laughing about the paper house, made a point of mentioning at the trading post that his sod walls were holding warmth just fine. "That paper palace'll be as cold as a dead man's bed by December," he said, and several men nodded. Mrs. Headstrom, who was not unkind but was deeply practical, sent Ben out to the Ingram claim with an extra wool blanket and a jar of tallow for her lamp. She did not expect the woman to survive, but she did not want the death on her conscience either. Ben returned with the blanket still folded. "She said she didn't need it," he reported. "She said the walls were doing their work." He hesitated, then added, "She was reading the walls, Ma, like a book. She had her finger on the paper and she was reading it." Mrs. Headstrom frowned and said nothing, but she thought about it all evening while she churned butter. A woman who read her own walls was not merely eccentric. She was holding something close. Samuel Rundle spent those same weeks asking careful questions. He did not ride out to the Ingram claim again. Instead, he visited the land office and examined the filing record. The paperwork was correct, but the name Deborah K. Ingram had a K that stood for nothing the clerk could identify. Rundle visited the trading post and studied the back issues of newspapers that Deborah had purchased. He found the legal notices section in a copy of the Philadelphia Inquirer dated June 1885. He found the notice regarding Alina Van Doren, and he recognized the surname from a wanted circular that had circulated through the Chicago Marshal's office 2 summers earlier, not an official warrant, but a private inquiry posted by the Hazlitt family, offering a substantial reward for information leading to the location of a missing woman. The circular had not used the word fugitive. It had used the word distressed. But Rundle knew the difference between a search for a troubled relative and a hunt for prey. The reward was $5,000, an almost absurd sum in a territory where a good horse cost $40. That money would buy a man a new life, and Samuel Rundle was tired of an old one. He did not act immediately. He was too cautious for haste. Instead, he began to cultivate an acquaintance with Lindquist, who knew the prairie better than anyone and who had, on 2 occasions, been near the Ingram claim at dusk. Rundle wanted to know what the trapper had seen. Lindquist, who disliked direct questions as much as he disliked loud people, offered only fragments. "She's got the walls packed tight," he said once. "Paper ain't just on the surface. She stuffed the gaps between the boards with it, too, like a bird lining a nest." He paused, chewing on a stem of dried grass. "And she talks to that dog like it understands every word, but she don't talk to nobody else." Then Lindquist added something that made Rundle's pulse quicken. "One night I seen her out behind the cabin with a spade. Ground was already half froze, but she was digging, burying something, couldn't see what." Rundle asked when this had happened. Lindquist thought for a moment. "Night after the first hard frost, October 23rd. That was the same week she had finished papering the walls." Rundle filed this away like a piece of evidence on a courtroom shelf, and he began to watch the Ingram claim more closely. Meanwhile, the cold deepened. On November 22nd, the temperature fell below zero for the first time that season, and the prairie became a world of white stillness. Ice formed along Cane Creek thick enough to support a wagon. The families hunkered down. Fires burned higher, and the men who had laughed at Deborah's paper house were too busy struggling with their own drafty walls and frozen water barrels to think much about her. But Olafson, whose sod house had developed a crack in the north wall that let a finger of cold air into the room where his children slept, did think of her. He thought of her with a resentment he could not fully explain. The paper house should have failed by now. It had not, and somehow that felt like an insult. On the night of November 24th, Olafson rode past the Ingram claim after dark. He had been checking on a mare that was due to foal early, and the route took him within sight of Deborah's cabin. He expected to see a dark, cold shack with frost creeping over the windows. Instead, a faint plume of smoke rose from the chimney, and through the single window he could see the warm glow of lantern light. He pulled his horse to a stop. The dog barked once from inside, and then the light shifted. Someone had moved to the window. He could not see her face, but he knew she was watching him. He shivered, and not entirely from the cold. Then he rode on, but the image stayed with him. That cabin should not have been warm. It defied everything he understood about survival, and a man whose understanding was threatened could become dangerous. The next morning, Olafson told the story at the trading post, and the tone of the laughter changed. It was no longer dismissive. It was uneasy. Mrs. Hedstrom asked Ben if the Ingram woman had ever said where she learned to build her walls that way. Ben said she had not, but he did remember one thing. While she was pasting the layers, she had told him that paper was a good insulator because it trapped air. Still, air keeps the cold out, she had said. That's why birds fluff their feathers. Ben had thought it was a strange thing for a woman to know, but he had not questioned it. By the first week of December, the temperature had plateaued at a brutal 10 below zero during the day, dropping to 20 below at night. The sky remained clear, a pale, unblinking blue, but the air itself had become an enemy that bit any exposed skin in seconds. Lindquist predicted the real storm was still coming. "The air's too quiet," he said. "It's saving something." And then on December 9th, the wind shifted north, and the sky turned the color of old iron. The held breath had arrived. Samuel Rundle chose that day to make his move. He had written a letter to the Hazlitt family's agent in Chicago, describing his suspicions and requesting verification of the description of Eleanor Van Doren. The letter would take weeks to reach its destination and longer to receive a reply, but Rundle did not intend to wait. He believed that if he could enter the cabin and find the physical evidence, the copy of the legal notice that she had undoubtedly kept, or the satchel with the false papers, he could secure the reward without any outside help. He only needed one opportunity. The coming blizzard would provide it. A storm like the one that was gathering could strand a woman alone for days, cut off from any help. And if a retired deputy marshal happened to seek shelter at her cabin in the middle of that storm, it would seem like luck, not a threat. He would wait until the snow began to fall in earnest, and then he would ride out with a story of a lame horse and a desperate need for warmth. Once inside, he would find what he needed. But Deborah was not waiting passively. She had felt the noose tightening ever since Rundle's first visit. She had seen him at the land office. She had heard from Ben about his questions at the trading post. She knew that the winter would not be the only thing trying to force her door open, so she prepared. She cleaned her revolver and kept it loaded beneath her apron. She moved the satchel with her remaining money and the Hazlitt documents from beneath the floorboards to a hole she had dug behind the chimney, covered with a loose stone. She slept lightly, the dog at her feet, and she read the walls every night, not for comfort, but for a kind of familiar vigilance. The newspaper layers held her past imprisoned. She was not going to let them become her epitaph. On the afternoon of December 10th, the first hard snow began to fall. It came not as gentle flakes but as sharp, wind-driven needles that stung the cheeks and filled the air with a hissing white roar. By sunset, the world had shrunk to the radius of a lantern's glow. Mrs. Hedstrom stood at her window and prayed for her sons. Lindquist checked his traps one last time and then bolted his door. Olafson banked his fire high and tried not to think about the crack in his north wall. And Samuel Rundle saddled his horse, wrapped a heavy scarf around his face, and began the slow, treacherous ride toward the Ingram claim under a sky that had turned as black as the inside of a closed fist. Inside the paper-lined cabin, Deborah heard the howl of the wind and knew that the test was no longer just about the cold. The storm had become a door, and someone was about to knock. The first pounding on the door was not a knock. It was a desperate thumping, muffled by the roar of the storm. Deborah's dog launched to its feet, barking wildly. She motioned it silent with a sharp gesture, her other hand already closing around the revolver beneath her apron. The thumping came again, accompanied by a hoarse voice she recognized. Rundle. He shouted something about a lame horse and a man freezing to death. The wind tore his words apart. Deborah stood motionless, staring at the door. She could let the storm take him. The prairie would ask no questions. But if his horse was truly down, his body would be found after the thaw, and the questions would begin with her. She was not ready for questions. She unbarred the door. Rundle stumbled inside in a swirl of snow and freezing air, his face half frozen beneath the crusted scarf. Ice had formed on his eyebrows. He could not stop shivering. He managed to gasp that his horse had thrown a shoe and gone lame a quarter-mile out, and that this cabin was the only light he could see through the whiteout. He did not mention that he had unhobbled the horse himself after lamming it with a hammer, or that he had timed his ride precisely to be caught. He only shivered and looked toward the stove with genuine need. Deborah said nothing. She rebarred the door and pointed to the bench near the fire. He sat. The storm had now sealed them both inside. For the first hour, Rundle said little. He warmed himself, accepted a tin cup of hot water, and studied the interior of the cabin through half-closed eyes. And what he saw was more extraordinary than any report. The walls were not merely covered in paper, they seemed to be made of it. The layers were so thick that the rough pine boards had become a smooth, almost padded surface. The air inside was still, and the temperature, while not comfortable, was far warmer than it should have been. Outside, the wind screamed at a pitch that threatened to peel a roof away, but inside, the sound was a low, steady hum. The paper was absorbing the cold that seeped through the outer logs, holding a cushion of dead air between the storm and the single room. The entire cabin had become a bird's nest, exactly as Lindquist had described, and every inch of that nest was printed with stories. Rundle began to read. It was impossible not to. The headlines fought for attention: market prices from Chicago, political speeches from Washington, announcements of weddings and deaths, and tucked into a corner above the dry sink, the legal notices. He saw the bold heading, Legal Notices, followed by columns of small type. He saw the date, June 18, 1885. He saw the name, Eleanor Van Doren. His pulse quickened, but he kept his expression mild, the practiced stillness of a man who had questioned more suspects than he could count. "Interesting reading you've got on your walls," he said, his voice casual. Deborah, standing near the stove with her back to him, did not turn. "Old papers keep the draft out." She spoke flatly, as if reciting a lesson. He nodded. "Sure, but most folks would turn the print side in. You left it facing out, almost like you wanted to keep the words visible." Finally looked at him. "Maybe I just like to read." The dog growled low. Rundle smiled thinly. Nothing wrong with that. He did not press further that night. The blizzard was too violent for interrogations. He needed her cooperation as much as she needed his. Outside, the temperature had dropped past 30 below zero. The cabin groaned in the gusts, and frost began creeping across the floorboards near the door, but the paper walls held. Deborah fed the stove and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. She did not sleep. Neither did Rundle. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, listening to the storm and weighing each other in the silence. By the morning of the second day, the world outside had vanished. There was no sunrise, only a pale shifting of gray beyond the frost-glazed window. The wind had not diminished, and now the true test began. The records from Fort Sully, kept by the military weather station, would later confirm that on December 11, 1887, the temperature in that region plunged to negative 41 degrees Fahrenheit. That was the cold snap that broke records, killed livestock, and froze men to death in their beds. Inside the paper-walled cabin, the stove burned at its limit, yet the far corner of the room, where the dog lay, still felt the bite of the air. Deborah took a candle and moved along the walls, pressing her hand against the paper. In some places, the outer layer felt cool but never frozen. The inner layers remained dry and almost warm. The flour paste had not cracked. The trapped air was doing its work. Rundle watched her test each section. "You've done this before," he said. It was not a question. Deborah did not answer, but her silence was the admission. She had learned the principle of insulated walls from a book on Arctic exploration that she had stolen from her former fiancé's library, a book detailing how explorers lined their huts with layers of canvas and paper. She had remembered it when she fled. She had planned for this, but she had not planned for a guest. Late that afternoon, with the storm still howling, Rundle made his move. He had spent the day memorizing the layout of the walls, tracing the sequence of the articles. Now he stood and walked slowly to the legal notices above the dry sink. He pointed to the name. "Elinor Van Doren, that's you." Deborah's hand moved toward her apron, but she stopped. The revolver was there, but shooting him inside this sealed box would be a death sentence for them both. Smoke, blood, and the loss of her only shelter. She let her hand fall. "My name is Deborah Ingram," she said. "Your name on the land papers is Deborah K. Ingram," he replied. "The K stands for nothing because you couldn't risk a real initial. You picked a name that would sound plain enough to be forgotten. But Van Doren isn't a name people forget, especially not when there's a reward." He told her what he knew, the private inquiry, the $5,000, the description that matched her exactly. He told her that he had written to the Hazlitt agents and that, once the thaw came, a reply would arrive with confirmation. She had only a few months before they descended. "But it doesn't have to end badly," he said. "You give me the ledgers, the proof you stole, and I'll make sure the Hazlitt family gets what they deserve in court. You can testify from here in writing. I'll protect your location. You'll be free." Deborah laughed, a short, bitter sound that startled the dog. "Free? The Hazlitts don't want the ledgers in a courtroom. They want them ashes and me ashes with them. That reward isn't for information. It's for a location on a grave." She stepped closer to the wall and pressed her finger against another column of text, barely visible beneath a layer of newsprint about grain futures. "And this," she said, "is the real trap." The notice she indicated was the one she had read on the first night of the cold. It was not from the Hazlitt family. It was a genuine estate notice, filed by a Philadelphia trust company, announcing that a sum of $10,000 had been left in trust for Elinor Van Doren by her maternal uncle, who had died intestate earlier that year. The inheritance was legitimate, but the Hazlitt lawyers had placed it into the same public notices, knowing that if Elinor ever emerged to claim it, their own search would end. The money was a lure. And Deborah had brought the lure into her home, pasting it on her wall like a prisoner's brand, because the paper itself was priced cheaply for the news, not the classifieds, and she had needed every scrap of insulation. Rundle stared at the notice. He read it 3 times, then he understood. The inheritance was real, but it was also a beacon. If Deborah ever attempted to claim it, she would have to reveal her identity and her location. The Hazlitts would be notified, and they would come. She had known this from the moment she pasted the page. She had chosen to live beside the promise of $10,000, unable to touch it, because the alternative was freezing without walls. Rundle sank back onto the bench. For the first time, he looked at her not as a fugitive or a reward, but as a woman who had calculated every cost and paid them all in advance. Then the storm delivered its final test. That night, the cold deepened past anything the prairie had seen in a decade. The thermometer that Deborah had nailed outside the door, visible through a small cleared patch of window, read 41 degrees below zero. The ink on the walls began to stiffen. The paste grew brittle at the seams. The outer layer of paper crackled when the wind pushed against the logs. Deborah placed her palm flat on the wall and held her breath. If the paper failed now, the cold would pour through and the single stove would be useless. The dog whined. Rundle stood and moved to the opposite wall, pressing his own hands against the paper as if trying to hold it in place by will. Neither spoke. The minutes stretched. The stove glowed red at its seams, and then around 3 in the morning the wind shifted. The scream softened to a low moan. The temperature outside remained murderous, but the gale had begun to break. The paper walls held. Deborah exhaled slowly and looked at Rundle. He nodded once, a gesture that held everything. The storm had built their truce. But the walls had one more secret to give. As the pale dawn of the third day finally cracked the darkness, Rundle, exhausted and half frozen, leaned against the section beside the door. His shoulder pressed into the layers, and beneath the outermost sheet, a corner of older newsprint detached from the paste and curled forward. He caught it. The paper behind it was a different issue, dated May of 1885, and it carried a headline he had not seen before. It read, "Hazlitt Safety Report Falsified, Whistleblower Missing." The article described how an unnamed female employee of the Hazlitt household had provided documents to a newspaper before disappearing. The article did not name her, but it described her as the fiancée of the Hazlitt heir. Rundle read it aloud, his voice hoarse. Deborah froze. She had not known that the newspaper had published the story. In her flight, she had missed this edition. The walls had just given Rundle the motive she had never admitted. She was not just a thief of money. She was the woman who had tried to expose a family that killed its workers. And the inheritance she could not claim was the very thing that now proved her honesty. Rundle set the curling paper on the table. "This changes things," he said. He looked at her. "If this story ran, then the Hazlitts are already under scrutiny. All you need is someone to bring the ledgers forward in a way that keeps you safe." He paused. "I can help." The storm had ended outside, but the silence inside was deeper. Deborah stared at the headline that had appeared from the wall like a message from her past, and she knew that the newspaper had not merely saved her life from the cold. It had just handed her the first weapon she had held since she left Philadelphia. The question that remained was whether she would trust a man who had ridden out here to betray her, and that answer would determine everything. The storm broke on the fourth morning, leaving behind a stillness so profound that the crack of a splitting log echoed across the frozen prairie like a gunshot. Deborah pushed open the door, and the world beyond was a sculpture of white drifts curved into impossible shapes. The creek vanished beneath a smoothed blanket, and the distant ridgeline erased as though drawn over with chalk. But the path between the cabin and the woodpile, barely covered, remained passable. The drift had curled high around the cabin walls, banked against the paper as though the storm itself had packed an extra blanket against the cold. Inside, the temperature held steady. The 6 layers of newsprint had never frozen. Rundle stepped outside behind her and stood for a long moment, surveying the massive snow wall that had built itself around the house without crushing it. He said nothing, but the look in his eyes had shifted permanently. He had come here hunting a fugitive. He had found an architect. The news of Deborah's survival traveled slowly at first, because the drifts made travel nearly impossible. But when Olafsson finally muscled his horse through the crusted snow on the 5th day, expecting to find a frozen shack, he saw the chimney puffing a steady column of smoke. He saw the woman and the ex-marshal shoveling a clear path to the goat shed as though this were an ordinary winter chore. And he saw his own breath vanish the moment he crossed an invisible line near the outer walls, a pocket of still air that confused the wind. He dismounted, walked up to the cabin, and put his bare hand against the outer paper seam. It was cool, but not killing. He pulled his hand back and looked at Deborah with an expression that contained no laughter whatsoever. His own sod house had lost its north wall to the cold. The crack he had ignored for weeks had widened under the deep freeze, and his youngest child had burned her fingers against the stove trying to stay warm. He asked, in a voice roughened by shame, how the paper worked. Deborah invited him inside for coffee. That invitation marked a change. Over the following weeks, the other homesteaders began to arrive, not with mockery but with notebooks. Lindquist came first, examining the still air basin around the cabin with the same silent calculation he reserved for wolf tracks and changing weather. He pronounced the paper walls a kind of artifice he had not seen in 40 years on the frontier, and then he asked if Deborah would show his own wife how to paste layers inside their sod house. Mrs. Hedstrom arrived with a jar of preserved plums and a question trembling on her lips. The question was not about insulation. It was about the walls themselves, all those words facing inward, all those columns of print that Deborah had read like scripture. She had glimpsed the legal notices. She had put together fragments. And now, sitting at the rough plank table while the dog dozed near the stove, she asked softly, "Who were you running from?" Deborah did not flinch. She told the truth, all of it. The Haslets, the bribes, the mine collapse that had killed 3 men, the $9,000 and the false name. She even pointed to the inheritance notice still pasted above the dry sink, the $10,000 she could never claim. Mrs. Hedstrom listened without interruption, and when the story was finished, she reached across the table and took Deborah's hand. "You pasted your own prison onto these walls," she said. "Now it's time to take it down." Rundle had already begun the work of dismantling that prison. He had written a second letter, this time not to the Hazlitt agents, but to a federal marshal in St. Louis named Carver, a man whose reputation for honesty had survived 20 years of political pressure. The letter described the ledgers, the newspaper article, and the identity of the witness. It proposed a sealed deposition, sworn testimony that could be entered into a grand jury proceeding without revealing the witness's location. And it noted in dry legal language that any person who attempted to interfere with a federal witness would be committing an additional crime. Rundle sent the letter with the next supply wagon that could reach a telegraph station. The reply would take weeks, perhaps months, but the machinery of justice, once ignited, was difficult to extinguish. The winter wore on in a slow rhythm of survival and waiting. Deborah taught the neighboring families her technique. Flour paste was cheap. Old newspapers could be gathered from the trading post and beyond. By January, 3 other cabins had interior walls lined with pasted layers, and the difference was measurable. Wood consumption dropped by a third. Frostbite cases diminished. Ben Hedstrom, who had become Deborah's unofficial apprentice, began experimenting with layering different kinds of paper, thick butcher sheets behind newsprint, old catalogs behind that, and reporting his findings with the gravity of a young academic. The paper house, once a joke, had become a model, and the woman who built it was no longer an outsider. She was the one who had figured out how to stack dead air in layers and survive a Dakota winter that even the old-timers had feared. Then, in early March, the reply from St. Louis arrived. Marshal Carver had accepted the deposition. The ledgers, delivered separately by Rundle through a trusted intermediary, matched the testimony of the newspaper article and provided undeniable proof of systematic fraud. The grand jury had issued sealed indictments against 3 senior members of the Hazlitt family on charges of bribery, criminal negligence, and obstruction of justice. The arrests had already been made in Philadelphia. The news had broken in the Eastern papers, and the Hazlitt coal empire was crumbling under the weight of public outrage. Elinor Van Doren was no longer a fugitive. She was a material witness whose safety had been guaranteed by the federal government. The moment Deborah read the letter, she crossed to the wall above the dry sink. Carefully, with a kitchen knife, she peeled away the top layers of paper, exposing the inheritance notice tucked beneath. She had laid that notice with flour paste in her own 2 hands, trapping herself beside a fortune she could never touch. Now she cut it free. The scrap of paper, brittle and yellowed, became the key to reclaiming everything else. She wrote to the Philadelphia Trust Company, providing the required identification proofs, including a copy of the newspaper notice itself, still legible. 6 weeks later, a bank draft for $10,000 minus administrative fees arrived at the trading post in her legal name. She endorsed it with a steady hand. Deborah K. Ingram, once Elinor Van Doren, was finally free to be either. That summer, a new cabin rose on the Ingram claim. It was larger, with 2 rooms and a loft, built from seasoned pine and insulated with a method that the settlers had begun calling paper banking. The original cabin remained standing, its walls still layered with the newsprint that had saved a life and kept a secret. Travelers sometimes asked to see it, and Deborah would oblige, walking them through the small room and pointing to the faint outlines of headlines that still whispered of distant cities, commodity prices, and a vanished world. Occasionally, while doing repairs, she would find a line of print she had never noticed before, a fragment of poetry, a weather report from a ship at sea, an advertisement for a seamstress in New York. Each discovery felt, she said, like the walls were still speaking to her. But the final surprise came in late autumn, a full year after the Great Cold Snap. A young man from the Yankton Press in Decoton, hearing rumors of the paper house and the woman who had built it, traveled to the claim to interview her. He was thorough and polite, and he spent 2 hours copying down details. Before leaving, he asked if he might examine the walls one last time. He was leaning close to a section near the door when he noticed, beneath a peeling corner, a tiny personal advertisement that had been entirely hidden under 2 layers. The ad, dated March of 1885, read simply, "EVD Mother's locket is with me. Right through the usual address. All is forgiven." J, the initials, the date, the cryptic reference, they unlocked a memory Deborah had buried even deeper than her former name. J was Jane, her childhood companion, the one friend who had known her before the Haslets, before the engagement, before the flight. The locket had been her mother's, lost in the chaos of her departure. And Jane had been trying to reach her across half the continent, placing an ad in a newspaper that, by a chain of chance so improbable it felt like design, had ended up pasted on the walls of a cabin in the Dakota Badlands. The message had been waiting for her all along, buried just beneath the surface, like a seed that needed the deepest winter to crack its shell. Deborah sat in the failing light, holding the fragile scrap of paper, and understood that the walls had done more than save her from the cold. They had held a map back to the life she thought she had lost, and that map, written in the smallest type, had only become visible after the storm tested every layer. The story of Deborah Ingram clings to the mind long after the facts have settled, not because she outwitted a deadly storm with flour paste and old newsprint, but because those walls became a kind of living archive. 6 layers of paper, each one a snapshot of a world that had already moved on. Commodity prices, political speeches, wedding announcements, and hidden among them, 2 notices that could have spelled her end or her beginning. One, a legal trap offering a fortune she could never safely claim. The other, a personal message so small it nearly vanished forever beneath the glue. That locket, that forgiveness, had traveled across a continent pressed between the pages of a newspaper, waiting for the precise moment when cold and chance would peel back the layer that concealed it. It is easy to view the past as something locked away in ledgers, photographs, and formal records. But Deborah's story reminds us that history is sometimes pasted to the walls of a one-room cabin, layered like sediment, waiting for the right set of eyes or the right catastrophe to bring it to light. What other messages are still suspended in the walls of old houses, in the lining of trunks, in the yellowed pages used to stuff a drafty window frame? How many secrets did the frontier swallow simply because no one thought to read the walls? Deborah never intended to build a monument. She intended to survive. But survival, when pursued with enough tenacity, often leaves behind something that outlasts the threat. The paper house stood for decades after that winter, and the method she pioneered, trapping dead air between fibrous layers, prefigured a principle that modern insulation would refine but never truly replace. The settlers who learned from her passed the knowledge on in a quiet chain of practice, the way true wisdom often travels, not through grand announcements, but through a neighbor showing another neighbor how to stir the paste. And still, the image that endures is not the technique. It is the woman in the lamplight, pressing her palm to the newsprint while a 40-below wind clawed at the outer logs, reading the words that held her past and her future in equal measure. She had wrapped herself in the language of the world she fled, and in doing so, she had made that language into armor. The cold that should have killed her instead became the force that preserved her, and ultimately revealed the one message that told her she had never been entirely alone. If you found yourself in that cabin, with frost creeping at the edges and only paper between you and the void, what would you read on your own walls? What forgotten notice, what lost inheritance might be waiting just beneath the surface? Perhaps the most important stories are not the ones we display, but the ones we layer over, trusting that the right moment will bring them back. Subscribe now to join us as we uncover more hidden histories, stories the world forgot, sealed behind paste and time.